starter decks for Commander, because as Commander decks get more and more competitive from the pre-con level onward, it inevitably becomes harder for newer players to get into this game. The idea is that if you're a new player and you don't understand some of the more complex things that are happening in Magic the Gathering, which is the most complex tabletop game to ever be made, honestly, then what tends to happen is a player gets overwhelmed by things and then backs off from playing the game. This is bad for you, the person who has a friend who you want to get into playing Magic the Gathering, and it's bad for that player in general because they don't have a good time. So, how do we solve this problem? Since we don't have $20 starter decks that Wizards of the Coast is making anymore, I guess this will have to be us taking on that duty as well. As usual, the rules are simple. We have a $20 budget for the main deck, $5 budget for the commander. And as far as the deck strategies, we need strategies that are linear, easy to understand for a new player, and will be able to function well at most tables right out of the box. These decks don't need to be dumbed down for new players in terms of their power level, but they do need to be dumbed down in terms of their complexity. When I'm making a $15 deck, the goal is to make a deck that functions at any table no matter what the cost is. The goal of making one of these decks is think of handing a deck to your grandma. Can she understand what's written on that card? If not, you've probably selected the wrong cards for that deck. So let's talk about what we are going to be building today. Today, we are going to be building Lathliss Dragon Queen. I think that for new players, having a commander that is able to tell you exactly what your strategy is going to be and then give you a huge bonus for executing well on that strategy will always be a wonderful time, and Lathliss Dragon Queen happens to fit in that category perfectly. She is a flying 6/6 creature with the correct artwork to play with this card. Please do not let anybody play with any other artwork of Lathliss the Dragon Queen. But whenever a non-token dragon enters the battlefield, you will create a 5/5 dragon token to accompany Lathliss, and you can pay mana into a fire-breathing effect that will give all of your dragons 1/0 until end of turn. Kind of a win more scenario, but honestly, if a new player were to look at this card, the only thing in their head would be, oh yeah, make dragons make dragons go make. And that's really all we need her to be. So we are going to be going with a Dragon Kindred strategy for Lathliss. With that said, let's go ahead and get into the core of what this deck is going to be doing. So, since we have a commander that wants us to drop lots of dragons on the battlefield, it's a good idea to make sure that the mana curve of the deck is as low as possible, because new players really kind of want to be able to play cards, not just feel like the game is happening around them. To this extent, I've tried to keep most of the dragons as the same cost as our commander, if not less. Otherwise, there's some super good payoff or way that their price can be discounted a lot. And I've tried to make sure that every dragon that we have here is one that does not have a nightmarishly complicated effect. Something that doesn't have to be kept track of all the time, except, say, when you enter combat. So, with that said, let's go ahead and look at the first part, which is just big dragons. These are the payoffs the deck is going for, beginning with Furnace Whelp, a 2/2 for 4, but it gets 1/0 until end of turn, a very, very basic dragon that will introduce a new player to the fire-breathing mechanic that is synonymous with red. Dragon Hatchling has a similar ability as well, while being a low mana cost. Volcanic Dragon is a 6 mana dragon, but it's got flying and haste, which will help a newer player get accustomed to the idea that sometimes red goes fast and goes burr. Rorik's Bladewing also has flying and haste for a similar mana cost, but with a better payoff. Red Dragon will burn all of the opponents as soon as it enters the battlefield, giving players a feeling that they are advancing the game state. Skyship Stalker has 3 different abilities it can use. Fire Breathing, which the Dragon Hatchling and Furnace Whelp should have already introduced a new player to. the ability to give itself first strike if it wants, and of course, haste because we are in red and red wants to go fast. Shivan Dragon because it's very important to appreciate the classics. Then we have Orscale Dragon, a 4/4 flying and haste dragon, but this dragon can discount its cost by 1 for every land in the graveyard. And while our deck is only really running 1 land that wants to go to the graveyard, Myriad Landscape, this will show a player that, hey, sometimes tossing those out of the hand or putting more lands like Evolving Wilds into a deck can have other benefits as well. Vengeful Ancestor is one of the more complicated dragons we have access to, but at 4 mana for a 3/4 flyer, I think it's reasonable to throw it in the deck for newer players. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, it will goad a creature, and if a goaded creature attacks, it'll deal 1 damage to its controller. A pretty standard ability for an established player, but introducing 1 small goad mechanic for a new player isn't the worst thing in the world. Territorial Hellkite might be a little hard for a newer player to grasp, but honestly, being a 4 mana flying haster with that stat line means that players will realize it's very, very worth it, even though there's a wall of text in front of them. At the beginning of combat on your turn, choose an opponent at random that it didn't attack before, and Territorial Hellkite can attack that player this combat. If you can't choose an opponent this way, you tap the Hellkite. Feels kind of awkward and clunky to use, but at the same time, the payoff for the stat line is there, and if a newer player realizes, oh, sometimes there are negatives associated with a card that make it much stronger in other areas, that's a fine lesson to learn. Varric's Blade Wing will introduce players to the kicker mechanic, which is very important because there are only 2 mechanics in all of Magic the Gathering, and they are flying and kicker. And, well, Varric's Blade Wing has the kicker and everything else has the flying, so here we go. But being able to spawn an extra dragon token alongside Varric's is helpful when establishing a board state if you cannot get your commander to stick. Archwing Dragon is a 4 mana flying haster, and at the beginning of the end step, return it to its hand. Again, another downside for what the dragon is doing, but it's still perfectly reasonable for the kind of deck we are building. A Chaos Dragon, which is a 3 mana flying haster that is forced to attack each combat with when able, and will introduce a fun dice rolling minigame when you enter combat. And that's about as complex as our dragons get, because the last one is Terror of Mount Velis. This is the haymaker. This is the surprise I am the dragon player and I win now card. When it enters the battlefield, all your creatures gain double strike until end of turn. Ideally, a new player will look at this card and recognize that it is the queen of their chessboard, and they should hold on to it accordingly, because once it hits the board, that's it. The game should be over. We also need to supplement the dragon tokens that are being spawned by our commander with some extra token production. So to facilitate that, we have a Dragon Master Outcast, which at the beginning of your upkeep will make a dragon if you have 6 or more lands, which our commander can't come down unless we've got 6 mana anyway, so most of the time this will just be doubling up on dragons for us. And then, of course, Dragon Cultist, which will give our commander the ability to spawn even more dragons if any of our dragons punch somebody in the nose hard enough. A reasonable payoff to be sure, even though the Dragon Cultist spell does require Lathliss to be out, and I do see that as a horrible downside for what is otherwise a fantastic include in a deck like this. But that does it for most of the core strategy. The idea is very simple. Get dragons on the board and hit your opponent multiple times with those dragons. A red aggro strategy should be perfectly easy to both understand and execute when you get into a game, and is very fun for a new player who just wants to see their board get established and do its thing very, very well. And mono red should be able to help with that very well indeed. But with that said, we are done talking about the core strategy of the deck. We do need to now get into how we're going to draw through the deck so that new players can have access to all the cards in their deck. Now, draw power in red is harder to come by than in other colors, so we are going to be relying mostly on looting mechanics, impulse draw, and stuff that will generate other types of supplementary draw power for our deck over and above what we have normally. While I would prefer having some stronger single target draw in a deck, unfortunately in mono red at our budget, it's going to be a little harder to facilitate that unless we want to start throwing in more wheel feels into the deck. But stuff like Wheel of Misfortune, while easy to fit in a budget, is very hard to explain to even some established players. So let's move into the draw package we are running within our deck, starting with Tormenting Voice. Draw 2 cards after discarding a card. Super simple and super powerful. Electric Revolution does the same thing, but it has Flashback, which can introduce a new player to the idea that their graveyard is a second hand in some situations. Thrill of Possibility, same idea, but at instant speed. Cathartic Reunion, same idea, but it's 2 for 3 instead of 1 for 2. And then we have Outpost Siege, a card that will introduce a choice mechanic that has a very simple choice to make. Choose cons or dragons. Cons, we get to have Impulse Draw at the beginning of every turn by exiling a card that we're allowed to play. Or dragons, where if a creature we control leaves the battlefield, we get to deal 1 damage to any target. Please explain that the dragons side of this should never be used ever in a real game of Magic the Gathering. It's always going to be the Impulse Draw. It will always be the Impulse Draw in most games. Then we have Pirate's Pillage, which lets us discard a card to draw 2 cards and make 2 treasure tokens. This is super important because, one, thematically, we are a dragon deck, so having a hoard of treasure that we are building feels kind of right. But at the same time, dragons am expensive, and our commander costs 6. So anything we can shove into the deck that can supplement getting that commander on the board faster so that the players doesn't feel like when their commander dies once, they're out of the game forever, will be helpful. So to facilitate that, we're also going to add an Unexpected Windfall, Big Score, and Seize the Spoils, which are all basically the same card, with the exception of Seize the Spoils, as it is a mana lower and grants 1 treasure instead of 2. But they are all still fantastic ways to facilitate digging through the deck, dumping extra copies of mountains you don't need in order to gain access to treasure and draw power. Then we have Nullspine Dragon, one of the most efficient ways you can draw in the deck. When it comes into play, discard your hand and draw cards equal to the damage dealt to an opponent this turn. If a player looks at this and realizes, oh, I can punch my opponent for 10 with Lathliss and one of its tokens, or any number of dragons I have, and then drop this down, I can get a huge hand of cards very, very quickly. The only thing that I wish we could do in mono red would be repeat effects like this, but that's kind of outside of our color's scope, so Nullspine Dragon will have to do as what it is in Singleton. Then we have Chandra Torch of Defiance. I tried to include a Planeswalker in every one of these decks because I think it's important to teach a new player how Planeswalkers work. They are a bit complicated, but I think that that's one of those foundational pieces of knowledge that if you don't have, you're going to get sniped by one at some point later in your time playing, so might as well learn now. Chandra Torch of Defiance gives us access to Impulse Draw with her +1, and extra mana to cast more dragons with her other +1. She's also got the ability to deal 4 damage to a creature if need be, and she's got an emblem at the end that, if you ever manage to get to it, is super cool and enticing for a player. But honestly, let people know that Chandra's main job here is just create mana, draw cards. Finally, we have Icon of Ancestry, which gives our dragons 1/1, not super important, but the ability to look at the top 3 cards of our library and keep putting new dragons into our hand is super important for this kind of deck. And since our deck is running 32 dragons, that's a 1 in 3 chance most of the time that you're going to be able to get a dragon off the top with Icon of Ancestry. This should keep a new player in the game and feeling like they are taking more than just a single game action a turn when they're using the icon to its full benefit. Just make sure to guide players on how to use cards like this if they are new and at your table and obviously seem to be struggling with things like missed triggers and missed opportunities. I am begging. No, I am pleading with you on my hands and knees that if you are teaching a new player about Magic the Gathering, please, for God's sake, please, please, please instill in them the necessity of taking down your opponent's resources so that they do not harm you. This is a strategy that needs to be adopted by players more often, especially when they are learning, because it helps players recognize what a board state looks like, as opposed to just focusing on their own turns, and as a result, not figuring out what they're going to do on their turns when they start. Making sure players understand that interaction solves problems. Interaction wins games. Interaction keeps you from losing games. If you can instill that in a player, then they're gonna have more fun games of Magic because they won't feel overwhelmed by certain decks, because they'll be able to recognize the lines they can use to assault certain strategies that are normally oppressive. What I'm saying is, please teach new players the value of Meteor Golem. I am dead serious. Meteor Golem is the first removal spell in this deck, and it blows up any non-land permanent an opponent controls. Normally, red suffers very hard with an inability to blow up enchantments, so putting one of these in a starter deck will teach a player that there are off-color solutions to problems they are facing in any game of Magic. Thank you. That was my PSA for Meteor Golem in starter decks, and also most other Magic the Gathering decks. Moving on, let's talk about a Braid, the next part of our removal package. We have a 14-card removal package. A Braid can deal 3 damage to a creature or blow up an artifact. Tyrant of Kerr Ridge can deal 4 damage to a target when it touches the board, and it has that ever-present ability to do fire breathing. Horde Smelting Dragon can blow up an artifact at any time and then gain XO, where X is that card's mana value. Glorybringer can deal 4 damage to a target non-dragon by exerting it, and thankfully, Glorybringer does say exactly what exerting does on the card. Realm Scorcher Hellkite can deal 1 damage to any target if you so choose, and if it's bargained, then you can add extra mana when you drop it on the board. But my main thing is this can kill mana dorks, and that's funny. Then we have Begarden Hellkite, which will deal 5 damage divided as you choose among any number of targets when it touches the board. Opportunistic Dragon, which can yank a human or an artifact away from a player. Chaos Warp, which will again remove any kind of problematic card on the board. Please, dear God, removal is cheap and easy. Then we have Tyrant's Familiar, a flying and haster that says if we have our commander out, it gets 2/2 and can deal 7 damage to any creature when it swings at a player who controls that creature. That's a stupidly powerful effect. Then we have Ryosei the Fallen Star, which if it's put into a graveyard will deal 5 damage to every creature without flying. This is borderline a board wipe. Then we have Drakaseth Maw of Flames, which can deal 4 damage to one target and 3 damage to 2 other targets every time it swings. This could actually just be the other commander of the deck if you so chose, because when this card is on the board, players feel powerful. Drakaseth, good. Then we have Scourge of Valkas. When it or another dragon enters the battlefield, deal X damage to any target, where X is the number of dragons you control. Now, Scourge has interesting abilities when you combine them with the commander of this deck, and the aha moment that will happen for a new player when they see this is kind of funny. But you get Scourge out, and they go, oh, yeah, I'll deal X damage to a target, and I've got, say, 3 dragons on the board. That's 3 damage, and you get to be the person that goes, no, it's better than that. Lathliss just triggered, and Lathliss is going to spawn another token. So Scourge is not only going to hit everybody for its initial damage, but that Scourge is also going to be able to get another bit of damage out as well. If our commander is on the board, Scourge of Valkas will always have a doubled up version of this ability, letting a new player basically control the creatures on the board as they see fit, so long as they don't have indestructible. Honestly, kind of a fun as hell payoff. Then we have Wrathful Red Dragon, which if you can, when a dragon you control is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to any other target that is not a dragon. That can also be a player. So if somebody decides they are going to use a Blasphemous Act, this can basically kill them if they decide to do so. Also, this is an instant win button if you are playing the Wrathful Red Dragon into a big enough board of dragons, because we also have access to a couple board wipes in this deck, one of which is Chain Reaction, which will deal X damage to every creature, where X is the number of creatures on the battlefield. So if you do end up building this deck for a new player, I want you to go into my comment section and tell me a story when this exact moment happens, because it will, and it will be glorious. The Wrathful Red Dragon is on the board. It's ready to deal damage to any target that is not a dragon. The new player just realized that that target legally can be a player. They have Chain Reaction in their hand, and the board has enough creatures for Chain Reaction to hit for some obscene amount of damage. 15, 20, you name it. They cast the card, they lose like 6 dragons, and realize, oh, that's like 120 damage I can aim at anyone I want. And they win the game off of that silly as hell interaction. If you get to witness this happening, if you are using this deck to teach a player how to play the game, I need your story of exactly how this happened and how this felt for that player, because this is one of the things we want to do when building these decks, is we want them to be simple, but have these little aha moments where the gears turn just enough where the player realizes, oh, I can do some wacky shit with this if I think about it. And then that gets players thinking about other ways they can abuse mechanics like this. Unfortunately, you may have just bred a stuffy doll player for life if you do this, but you know, that's a small price to pay for getting your friend into Magic the Gathering, right? Finally, we have Thunder Dragon, which will deal 3 damage to each creature without flying when it touches the board, which will be most creatures anyway, if any normal game of Commander is to be believed. And that does it for our controlling section of the deck. Every kind of removal and interaction you can think of that we are running has been laid out here. Now we gotta talk about ramp and how we're gonna get all these expensive as hell dragons on the board. Finally, we need to get lots of dragons on the board, and especially if you're a newer player getting frustrated at not being able to get these big, expensive, dirtly monstrosities out there, we need to make sure that our deck is sculpted in such a way that it will make it very easy to see the path to getting these big bodies on the board. So we need to go ahead and talk about Sol Ring and every card that looked kind of like it. You know, because it's Sol Ring, everyone. Anyway, Sol Ring taps for mana. You know what it does. New players will be enthralled by it. Then we have Sad Robot, Psalm Simulacrum. It'll get a basic land out of the deck when it hits the battlefield, and if it dies, it'll draw a card. Golem's Eye can add 2 mana to your mana pool. It's a Sol Ring, but bad, but decent in this kind of deck. Then we have an Arcane Signet to give us red mana, Hedron Archive to give us 2 mana like the Golem's Eye, and late in the game can also draw us cards. Wayfarer's Bauble can grab us a mountain, Sisay's Ring is another copy of the Golem's Eye, Mind Stone can give us 1 mana, but also lets us draw a card later in the game. It's also got Command Sphere, which is doing the same thing. Planner Atlas gives us the ability to smooth out land drops early in the game while giving colorless mana on top of that. Fire Diamond gives us red mana. And then we've got some dragons that are giving us mana too. Rapacious Dragon gives us 2 treasures. Swashbuckler Extraordinaire and Patron of the Arts give us 1 treasure. And Reckless Barbarian is a 2 mana creature that can be sacked for 2 mana at any time when you need it. This is all in all a 16 card ramp package, not counting the 39 lands the deck is running, because we've also got 38 mountains and 1 Nereid landscape. A hefty amount of lands to be sure, but we desperately want to make sure that our commander is able to come out as often as humanly possible. So, honestly, we need a lot of ramp to facilitate that. Hopefully that should be enough to start somebody on their Magic the Gathering journey with Lathliss the Dragon Queen, and obviously if you're playing her, you can give somebody the normal printing of Lathliss first if you want. That's fine. I guess it's not the worst thing in the world, but I'm gonna be honest, if you're starting somebody off in Magic, this is gonna be a lot more funny. It'll be a lot better to have them have this cartoon drawing just smacking people up in the face. Trust me, they'll realize how endearing this game can be. But all in all, it is a basic dragon deck that has one goal: get big guys out, turn them sideways, and win the game. That should be a linear enough strategy for most newer players, and most of the cards that we have in here do not necessarily tread the water of having too much text or being too overly complicated. They're fairly simple to use. So, let me know what you think in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you haven't already. Let me know if you're enjoying this starter deck series and if you have any suggestions for how it can be improved. I'm always looking for feedback, so thank you for every single one of you who watches these, even if you're an established Magic player who doesn't necessarily care too much about the idea of, you know, starter decks that they may never build or play. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you haven't already. And as always, everyone, insert end of video tagline here. Hey, I just quickly want to give a thank you to all of my wonderful patrons who keep this show running. YouTube and Twitch are a pretty bumpy ride at the best of times, and the stability that Patreon provides me is worth more than I can say here. I'd also like to thank each and every one of my $20 and up patrons here, and they would be Red Joker, Blitzkrieg, Cameron, Dren, Jemshin, Smiling DM, Poundini, Mabbity Babbity, Naomi, Isaac, Agamotto, Jordan, Ravi, Giuni, Kiratorian, Prisma, all of you, Sagitt, I'm not saying that part, and Starlight. And finally, thank you to everyone else that helps keep this channel alive. While you're here, why not check out another video? And thank you for watching.